The StreamYard here, we have our third conversation, episode 3, in Turning Points, studying some decisive moments throughout church history. My name is Josh Rodriguez, associate pastor here at Nashville, First Pres Nashville. With me today, the Reverend Dr. Stuart Gordon. Welcome, Stuart. And also guest conversationalist here with us, Wes Ramsey. Stuart, do you want to say a couple things before I get into the bio for Wes?
Hi, Josh. Hi, Wes. Good to be with you today.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, glad to have y'all. Here. Wes, thank you for joining the Peanut Gallery here in our conversations in church history. A little bit about Wes, a longtime member, nearly 20 years of First Pres, native of Nashville. Yeah, those are unicorns these days. Nashville native. You have worked in the musical industry after studying there at University of Louisville. You kind of span the genres between bluegrass to gospel to classical. Mm-hmm. And your wife, of course, we know, Carol McClure, wonderful woman. You may notice her on the harp, or one of her students on the harp, in any given worship service. And then your children have followed in your footsteps a little bit, studying, your daughter there working, your son's in New York City, and then your daughter over in Baltimore working as a practitioner, a midwife nurse practitioner. So you... that's a little bit. Do you want to fill in any gaps, Wes? What did I miss? I'm sure there's a lot of life in there I didn't speak to, but
no, that's the high points. It's
okay.
It's too wordy and complicated to explain it all. Some days I don't even understand. So that's enough.
Another podcast for another time.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to say, Wes, why you would now be talking with all of that? Why would you be talking about church history with a couple of pastors today?
Well, that's a good question. I've always been an avid reader and an avid layperson. I've never once felt any stirring or call to go into full-time ministry. Just, it just doesn't exist. And but I've always read from early days, always been an avid reader. And right now, what I see happening and what I've seen happening for 40 years is we're living in a culture that has re-paganized. And it's interesting times to be in the church in a context that's rapidly changed around us. And it isn't like we weren't warned about this. We had ample warning, and most of those warnings were ignored. There's a little book that I refer to and often share by Malcolm Muggeridge. A couple of lectures he gave in around 1970 called The End of Christendom. And he called it. He absolutely called what was about to happen. The same thing we were discussing, Stuart and I were discussing, laughing yesterday about that fateful day when Alexander Solzhenitsyn stepped into Harvard Yard, was it 78, and gave that address. He entered a hero and he left a forgotten man because nobody wanted to hear what he had to say. And he was disappeared, essentially. So it isn't like we haven't been warned, but here we are. And so church history is a very relevant topic because how did the church grow in a really hostile pagan culture? How did it survive? And we're there again. I don't feel like I'm not paranoid, but it's not hard to look around and see what's happened. So that's, if that's any explanation, that'd be why I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm concerned for my grandchildren.
Yeah. Well, and to be honest, Wes, you're not the first person I've heard talk about the modern day church and sort of say, we are really getting to a place with the modern church that our culture is starting to look much more like the culture of the first church, or when the church first began back in Acts. And it's almost the opportunity before us is to take seriously how much we can look back in our own history to understand the road ahead of us in some form or fashion. So that is where we're at as a modern church. And kind of a bit of a segue, Stuart. I know you're going to kick us off here in Acts a little bit, but maybe you want to get us started here a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. When we talked about this whole series on turning points, I realized, teaching church history within the congregation always needs an anchor. It's hard to, hand a big history textbook to a whole group of people who aren't required to read it and take tests on it, and ask them to read church history. And so what we need is illustrative text from Scripture. Once the Bible is closed on Revelation 21, what text do we have to sort of give folks a flavor of what we're talking about? And so really what we want to discuss on today's podcast is that experience of the first Christians spreading outward from Jerusalem into the Mediterranean world, commissioned and sent forth to preach the gospel, but having to be prepared for what or whom they find when they go. And Wes had shared with me, bought this book for me, had it mailed to me just a few weeks ago by Rodney Stark, who's a sociologist who wrote this book back in, I think, 76, Wes, you can correct me on that, in which he offered his own theory, and I think it's a well thought through theory, of how long, there's several essays in it. The one I'm focusing on is the importance of Greek-speaking diaspora Jews in Mediterranean cities to be receiving the first Christian witnesses and to be the first converts out in the Mediterranean world. So that's really the fascinating historical piece that I wanted to discuss with Wes today. And so let me start with just a little bit from Acts 11. This is the illustrative text we use to kind of give folks a flavor of what we're talking about. Those who were scattered because of the persecution that took place over Stephen in Jerusalem traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, and they spoke the word to no one except Jews. But among them were some men of Cyprus and Cyrene who, on coming to Antioch, spoke to the Hellenists also, proclaiming the Lord Jesus. So here's a little window, just a couple of verses into the geographic and sort of social realities of the church spreading out from Jerusalem. There's a persecution that takes place in Jerusalem. They're spread into Phoenicia, Cyprus, other areas of the Mediterranean. And they come and they speak to no one but Jews, okay? And they spoke to someone called Hellenists also. And so that's where the missionary enterprise in the book of Acts seems to begin. And that's what I'd like to unpack a little bit today. I'll stop talking. I've been running my mouth too long now.
Well, honestly, Stuart, even as you were saying that, I mean, it's so wild to think about how the church got from Jerusalem, and I don't mean, well, you understand how the church in Jerusalem got from there to here, and all the steps along the way, the little A to B's before we exist as we do right now. And it's so easy to read something like Acts 11 and not really think, they spoke to no one except Jews. Well, why? and Hellenists, what? Okay, what? It's pretty easy to, do a devotional in the morning and not really pick up on that and not really think what implications that has for the church, if any implications. But obviously, the fact that we're bringing it up, we tend to believe there are. So, Wes, do you want to speak to that a little bit before we kind of keep the ball rolling here?
Well, if you think about it, it makes sense. because the folks sent out from Jerusalem, raised in Judaism, and raised in a very, I can't say it, singular tradition of Judaism, are naturally going to show up at the synagogue when they travel. And the first piece, of course, they're going to speak to Jews and then to Hellenists, because that's where they're going to be most comfortable. And that's where they're going to have some context of understanding what they're talking about. And it is interesting that the sequence of the story is they talk to Jews first and then to Hellenists. Well, the Hellenists were also Jews, but they had been away from the Middle East for quite a while. The first language was Greek, not Hebrew. So we would have to say, if talking to Jews, the first language would probably be Hebrew, Aramaic, then Greek. Talking to Hellenists, it's Greek, then maybe some Hebrew. So, but there's enough of a context of they didn't have to explain, for instance, the idea of monotheism to the Jews or Hellenists. There's a baseline understanding of there's one God, and there was Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They could talk in that context, and so that's the first place to go. If they were to go into a Greek temple and try and explain all of all of Judaism and Christianity to some person doing rituals for Apollo, they'd be talking past them. And so with the Jews and Hellenists, you're talking to them. I've had the experience of talking past people, or having people talk past me, and I realize I have no idea the basis of what they're talking about, much less anything else. So that's the natural place. And if we want to talk about providence, we have to look at God's hand. Before those events occurred in Jerusalem, there was a widespread community of Jews and Hellenists already out there to talk to spread the word to, and that was in place already. So those have been my first thoughts on it. Maybe I talked too long, but that'd be it.
No, that's spot on. And I, even starting there, naming sort of the foundations that are undergirding the conversations of the church spreading this way. I had a professor in seminary. I went up to him after one of the lectures and I said, I am doing my best to keep up with you, but I feel like I'm just trying to drink out of a fire hydrant. And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, well, I'll try not to point it at your chest. and he just kept going. But I mean, you can really miss out on a lot when you forget of all the foundational things that are contributing to, even in the words they spoke to, right? Like that even takes us back to, shortens they spoke to no one except Jews, with the fact that they were speaking to them. What was undergirding those conversations? In general, there's enough there to try to think through what the process of the church spreading would have looked like.
Yeah.
May I follow up on that, Josh?
Yeah,
because this is, for me, we just did the big read as a congregation, and I was really hoping that whatever we did next would still link to the big read. And this, to me, is one of those really strong links in the chain. We learned in reading the Old Testament about the diaspora. We learned about the exile in 587 BC when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, carted off the best and the brightest of the Israelites to serve in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. And we learned how the Jews have been spread away from Jerusalem. And what we find in the Hellenistic era is that this is Rodney Stark's research that he's accrued here, not all of it original, that there was a substantial population of Jews living in every major city of the Mediterranean world in the first century. 5 to 10% of the population in every city was Jewish. Wes mentioned the providence of God. The providence of God, that there would be a receptor community in these, and early Christianity was an urban phenomenon. It was not rural. The missionaries went into the cities, and Stark's theory is that a new faith is born through sociological connections, through social connections, more than through, say, door knocking or Paul standing at the agora and preaching. But these guys would go to a new city. Where do they go? They go to the Jewish sector. They worship in the synagogue on the Sabbath. They meet and make connections with people. And as Wes just described, there is a shared worldview that is ready-made for them to begin this process of evangelization.
Sorry, I'm trying to understand the implications of that, sir. I never considered that all the way back from Old Testament, that thinking about the providence of God, it would have been set up that way. So by the time you have New Testament people moving about, there is someone in that city that is going to understand the conversation.
If you go to the Jerusalem Museum, which I've had one opportunity to do, there's an enormous exhibit in the Jerusalem Museum of reconstituted synagogues from all over the world. They took really ancient synagogues that were, archaeologically dug up, painstakingly packed them, moved them to Jerusalem, and put them together so that you see these actual synagogues from around the Hellenistic world. Those were the very places where those first Christian missionaries were making their first connections, in places like Antioch.
Yeah. Also, Stark points out that contrary to kind of a Marxist view of history, the first people that were being talked to, and the first to embrace Christianity, were not poor, ignorant yokels. They were people of education and people with means, and people who were well established in the societies in which they lived. And Stark makes very clear that the Marxist view of, which is a opiate of the people, just the little
huddled masses, the
huddled masses, the deplorables, et cetera, that's not the case. And a lot of them were women, because the Christian message gave a great deal more, how can I say it, credence, status, hope, whatever you want to call it, to women. The practice of just abandoning children after birth because they weren't wanted was, it's unthinkable now. But the majority, most of the babies who were abandoned and killed were girls. And Christianity eventually abolished that practice, and just that alone was significant for women. There's also, I'm changing subject. There's also a third category. There are the Jews, the Hellenists, and there's a third category called the God-fearers. These were Gentiles who were dissatisfied with what the pagan world had to say to them about the nature of life. And so they would, in effect, sit in the back of the synagogue and listen, and even organize their lives to some extent around around Judaism, even though they never became full converts. And so that group could also be talked to, because again, they had embraced monotheism and ethical monotheism, and that and again, that was a third layer out. I think, am I right, Stuart? In the temple at Jerusalem, wasn't there a porch for the God-fearers to visit?
Well, the court of the Gentiles, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there you go.
And Wes, to me, this is like somebody just showed me another room in my house that was always there, and it didn't really know it was there, didn't see it. All the things we read in the New Testament, I've come to the conclusion in the last few years that the single most important issue of church life in the first 2 centuries, first century at least, probably second too, was, can Gentiles be Christians without becoming Jewish? You see it in all of Paul's discussions, Galatians primarily, but it's not just in Galatians. You see it in the Jerusalem Council in the book of Acts. Must Gentiles be circumcised and obey the purity laws and the dietary laws in order to be Christian? And Paul is very strongly an advocate for the full inclusion, Jew, Greek, slave free, male, female, all are one in Christ, not because they observe the ceremonial aspects of the law, but because they are welcomed by faith. And so all this discussion from starts, shining lights for me. So here are Hellenistic Jews who've been living out of Jerusalem for generations, who are trying to balance faith in Israel's God with being able to function in Hellenistic society. Then you have Hellenists who are indicatively more strongly Greek, and God-fearers for whom they never tried to obey the law. And there's something perhaps remarkably appealing about a gospel that welcomes them into the household of God on the basis of faith without the requirement that they keep the law. Mm-hmm. That's my aha.
Yeah. Or
go ahead, Wes.
Sorry. Or
Josh, you go.
Your turn.
Just how liberating that would have been.
Yeah.
Like, how liberating would it have been to find out I can actually participate in this beyond just the courtyard of the Gentiles? How much more, and not that it's just an act of hospitality, but just the more authentic welcoming of someone to participate in this beyond what they were able to, this faith. Yeah. Wes, you were going to say?
Well, that controversy generally tore the early church apart. And Paul and St. Peter got into a major row over this. And it took a divine intervention on behalf of the Almighty in a dream sent to Peter that helped solve the question. But it was that big of a row that the reason didn't seem to hold sway. It took some sort of intervention. But I think the Council in Jerusalem settled it by saying, Paul, we think you have a point. Go out to the Gentile world. And but it was a huge thing. It was a huge thing. And also,
Paul says in Galatians that he got in Peter's face and says, if you, a Jew, live like a Gentile until the Jews show up, how can you expect Gentiles to act like Jews?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And also, although Paul never met Christ in the flesh, he certainly must have been in conversation with those who knew him in the flesh, and Christ is quoted as saying, "When I am lifted up, I will draw all people to me." And he didn't pre-qualify it with all duly circumcised and confirmed. Anybody who's passed the bar mitzvah, yada 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 yada. He said all people, and the account of the penitent thief is one of the most important in Scripture, because there wasn't time and opportunity for that man, and he didn't even have the ability to articulate anything of a theological nature. All he had left was say, "Remember me," and that was enough. And so to impose the Jewish tradition upon Gentiles would have been a bridge too far, I think. And Paul kept pounding that, and I think it's a good point to keep in mind today, even because we can slip back into it.
Well, and even, well, no, don't, not now. Now you got us here. You gotta walk us forward. But thinking through, and Noel makes a point of this in his book. He's going to put it in a different conversation that we'll get there. But just the fact that you have a very early church who comes up against a situation that is so wildly divisive that the potential for the church to just fall apart and fall into nothingness of, we just couldn't get past our differences. People stood so far apart. There was no way forward because we refused to figure this out. And yet the early church, I mean, because we're sitting here, figured it out in a way that we all would be sitting on a StreamYard today, looking back and saying, look at how they navigated this. Look at what they did.
Mm-hmm. I think Noel's theory, which I think is certainly defensible, is that the Greek-speaking Jews were far more central to the church for longer than the traditional theories have been. The traditional theories have been that it became mostly a Gentile movement pretty soon in the 2nd century. And after that, it was basically Gentile movement and then opposition from Jews. And he bases it on a sociological theory, and he looks at the remarkable growth of the church in the first few centuries, and he matches those two things up and says it is completely plausible that the way the church was able to grow this fast, this quickly, was because it continued to connect with Greek-speaking Jews through the empire. And so for me, the interesting theological issue then is how the church became that universal fellowship that was not just ethnically Jewish, but which was Jew and Greek, slave and free, male and female. And one of the ways that happened was because they were speaking Greek. If they had been speaking Hebrew, very limited ability to spread, but because they were speaking the lingua franca at the time, the church could spread.
Yeah.
The world would be a very different place had Paul written his correspondence in Hebrew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's significant that he wrote it in Greek. And he argued his legal case in Latin.
Seriously?
Likely so. At Rome?
Didn't know that.
Probably.
I'm not doubting you, but
yeah,
I
think
just
about it. He probably and before the when he was on Crete, he may have done it in Greek, but when he's with the authorities in Rome, he's probably doing it. He's probably operating in Latin. So here he was, master of 4 languages: Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, Latin. He wrote in Greek, the lingua franca, so that the world at large could understand. And it took some time before the Aramaic and Hebrew Gospels made it into Greek, if I understand correctly. I don't know the dates.
Well, that to me is a huge point. We can unpack that further. When the New Testament cites the Old Testament, it cites the Septuagint. All the authors of the New Testament quote the Greek version of the Old Testament, not the Hebrew version of it, which speaks volumes about who the receptor audience is.
Yeah, I stand corrected about that then, about the translations. Excuse me.
So think about the Septuagint, which had been in the hands of Jews for over 300 years by the time of Jesus. A translation done in the 3rd century in Alexandria, Egypt. Why? Why did the Old Testament, the Bible at the time, need to be in Greek? Because so many Jews had spread throughout the world, they didn't know Hebrew. They were living in a Hellenistic world in which the language was Greek, and that's what they spoke. So, if my ancestors from Scotland were speaking early Middle English or something, which would be unrecognizable to me, and I am removed from that here in the New World speaking English, I would not have any connection to, my heritage. In the same way, the Jews who had been spread throughout the Mediterranean world, if they were going to read their scriptures, it had to be in their language, which was Greek. And so the Old Testament scriptures existed for Jews for over 300 years by the time of Jesus. And so when Paul is writing to Jewish audiences about the gospel, he cites the Bible they know, the Greek, the Septuagint.
I'd never thought about that. There's all sorts of things sort of going on in here, but that changes just the perspective that it provides.
Yeah, and Paul, so interesting. He was a rabbi, studied at the feet of Gamaliel, and fully qualified in that world. He was also, as a Roman citizen, fully qualified in that world. He wrote and he was fluent in Greek, fully qualified in that world. He was a rabbi. In effect, he was an attorney of his day. I mean,
just read Romans. You'll know he's an attorney.
He's an attorney. He's a lawyer. He's a lawyer. And when he spoke before Cyrus, he did it in the language of the lawyers of the day, and it's only the preamble of his address is preserved, but it's noted that the linguistic style was the lawyerly style of the day. It's hard to overestimate the pivotal role that Paul played as the hinge and the door between the cultures. If we didn't have Paul, we wouldn't have a West. It goes that far. He was uniquely qualified, and also the dramatic turn of events in his life, going from persecutor to apologist, is a central story, a central role. That everything would be different without him. One of my favorite books on the shelf is History of Christianity by Paul Johnson, the British historian, and he asserts that in effect the Western Church is the Church of Paul, because he made it possible. And so, but it is that being conversant with all those cultures that made Christianity blossom. Also, Christianity and the Christian gospel hold a special place and special role. Stark talks about it in that the pagan cultures, and the whole series of gods, both as expressed in the Greek culture and Roman culture, they offer everything one could want, except a true ethical system and an answer to the question of ultimate destiny. And ethical monotheism, which is a gift of the Jews to the world, points in that direction. And so one can assume there's some real dissatisfaction in the culture because Stark talks about the pandemics that happened and how in the face of those pandemics, all social order broke down and all sense of ethics broke down for many people. And the Christian gospel offered the solution that the Greek culture or the pagan culture around them could not. And so it was also a matter of timing. At the perfect time, when the dissatisfaction was bubbling up, along come those early Christians. Along comes Paul, and the conditions were ripe at that point. I say in my amateur way.
Well, in these latter days,
Hearing you say that, Wes, thinking maybe you might even consider. I don't know enough about pagan religions of that time. I know some about the Greek gods, but just the idea when you read something like in Hebrews 13, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and thinking about a people coming from a culture where the gods less stable, less consistent, less predictable, and then you have a religion that's putting forth a God and a Savior in Jesus that is much more consistent, to say the least. Just the broad appeal that may have offered to those first listeners to this gospel. Certainly not knowing exactly the author of Hebrews or where that's coming from, but knowing it came from that era is just incredibly interesting to consider how they would have heard a word like that.
I think you see that Eugene Peterson, I think, makes this point in his study of Colossians. One gets the feeling that religion in a polytheistic worldview is like having to deal with an enormous bureaucracy. The emphasis in Colossians is on the unity of God and God's lordship over the whole creation. And it's a liberating word to hear that when one makes a supplication to God, one does not have to file papers at this office in this department and then walk down the hall to the Department of Agriculture for rain prayers, and walk down the hall to the Department of War for success in war, and then walk down the hall to the Department of Love for success there. But that there is one God over nature and history. And so one is liberated from this really oppressive structure in which there's any number of gods and any number of sacrifices that need to be made. So when you go to one of the ancient cities and you still see the temples where there are different temples throughout the city dedicated to different gods, That was the essence, as I understand it, of religion at the time. It was not ethical, as Wes is pointing out. It was basically cultic. So you go make your sacrifices at this particular temple, and then you go make your sacrifices at this particular temple and at this particular temple. And there's no ethical structure to that. It's simply pay your dues, make your offering, see if you can get from the gods what it is you're looking for.
Yeah. Stuart, can I ask you, I know we're headed towards Chalcedon, and we're time-wise getting about there. Can you take our conversation from here to 451 for Chalcedon?
Yeah, sure thing. So the Greek language, here's the fascinating thing to me, is that one of the issues we're approaching here is what is the relationship between the Church of Jesus Christ and its roots, which is Judaism, which is the faith of Israel, worshiping the God of Israel, the maker of heaven and earth, the Lord. This is where the church, I think, has to be honest about where it's continuous to and discontinuous from its roots in Israel. We need to be very cautious about coming across as supersessionist. I'm not in the school of thought that says the church left Israel behind. No, I believe very strongly that Romans 9 through 11 says, God's promises are sure to his people. His covenant with Abraham is eternal. And so we're not talking about leaving Israel behind. We're talking about the promises of God bearing fruit in the inclusion of the Gentiles in this covenant that God made with Abraham. Now, what we see practically worked out is, in order for that to happen, the language of communication became the language of the empire. Okay, it wasn't Hebrew, it was Greek, so that the scriptures of Israel's God could be known by people who were not Hebrews. Okay, and by necessity, the thought world is going to be influenced by that.
Yeah.
The notion that God would take on flesh in a man would be offensive to folks who believe in the transcendence of God. So for Muslims, that still remains an offensive notion that God would take on flesh. All the doctrinal developments that happen after the book of Revelation are the church's efforts to further bear witness to their conviction that they had met in the man Jesus of Nazareth, God in the flesh. The language that the Gospels use about it is not so explicit and so refined as you get in the doctrinal language of the creeds, but they are the source of what would become the church's testimony that in some way that Jesus is the only begotten Son of God, begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father, through whom all things were made. They had to have that language and its concepts to further bear witness to the conviction that this Jewish carpenter from Nazareth is in fact the incarnate Son of God.
Yeah. Wow. Which, gosh, just trying to pinpoint even the understanding that we're not just dealing with language that makes it into creeds, right? Though that happens, but you have to have thoughts and the thought process, and without certain understandings, the words won't do it justice, right? Yeah. And so knowing that they are pulling all of that together, and you can only imagine why people in the 5th century were still trying to figure this out and trying to put words to it all, to say this is what was happening in Jesus.
So Josh, let me give you an example. So when I'm in Cuba several years ago, I'm the guy who's pretending to speak Spanish, right? I took Spanish in college. That had been about 20 years earlier. Never had an immersion experience. So I never became fluent in Spanish, but I fake speaking Spanish, right? Yeah. So when I preach on Sunday morning, I wrote the sermon in English. Dopico translated it for me, and then I read it. Okay, so I got up in the pulpit on Sunday and I read my sermon, okay, in Spanish. And afterwards, I'm conversing with one of the young women of the church as a member of the choir in Spanish, a little bit. And what she said to me was, your pronunciation is excellent, but your grammar is horrible. So I can fake speaking Spanish.
Yeah.
And I'll blame it on Dopico. He's the one who did the translation on me. So anyway, we get to the house church that Wednesday evening for their Bible study. And I can understand more than I can say, but we exchange pleasantries. And then the lady who's the host of it turns to me and says, and Pastor, since you speak Spanish, we'd like for you to do the lesson tonight.
Yep. Yep.
So I open a Spanish Bible and I read Psalm 100 in Spanish, and I can fake reading it. And then I just open my mouth and try to start talking about the scriptures in what is not my language.
Yeah.
And I realized, wow, how unequipped am I for this task?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is you. I mean, you nailed it there. The story, the understanding. Yeah.
And each language has its own unique thought processes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it's sometimes hard to bridge the gap between meaning in languages. In my misspent youth, I spent 2 years in Mexico working with the symphony orchestra in Guadalajara, and it took me a while to understand that in Mexican Spanish, mañana did not mean tomorrow. Mañana meant some point in the future when I decide to get around to it.
In Jamaica, that's soon come.
Yeah.
I would say, yeah. And finally, I would say, the shopkeeper would say mañana. I'd say mañana in mañana fijo or mañana por la mañana, and then kind of bueno mañana por la mañana, and it would but I had to immerse into how they thought in Spanish, and some things didn't cross over. As you know, the verb esperar,
yep,
is to hope and to expect. And in English, those are two different meanings. In Spanish, they use one word and so crossing Hebrew into Greek and Greek into Latin, and then further out into the various dialects, you would have to have a council like Chalcedon to fix language. Yeah. And did they compose that in Latin or Greek?
It's Greek. Yeah,
it's in Greek. They composed it in Greek.
So the Creed of Nicaea from 325, which got further development in the Second Council of Nicaea in 381, and really came to conclusion with the Chalcedonian definition of 451, in which they are using, the big word in the Creed of Nicaea is homoousion to patri, of the same substance as the Father. That's a Greek term, and the debate was, shall we insert an I in there, an iota, and shall it be homoousion to patri, of like substance as the Father, or is it of homoousion, of the same substance of the Father? Okay, blood, sweat, and tears spilled over that.
Yeah.
And in the development of doctrine, important thing to remember, okay? Just like in life, we experience something and then we try to put words on it.
Yep.
Okay? We are trying to bear witness. And so in the case of the earliest Christians, they saw Jesus, whom they had followed for 3 years, crucified and buried, and then raised, and then became the task of making sense of that, of bearing witness to it, of putting language on the experience of Jesus crucified, buried, and risen.
Yeah.
And that is a long-term project, right? You can't just encapsulate that one in 5 minutes. You spend generations and you make one claim, okay, Jesus is the Son of God. Then you realize, well, that implicates other things. If he is the Son of God, in what sense, how is he related to the Father? And how human is he? How is he like us? And how is he like God if he is both God and human? And that's what the Chalcedonian definition was tasked with doing, was saying in what sense he is like God and like us. And in what ways is he like God, or not like he is God, he is us. And in what sense does that make sense? And so you're looking at the brave and brilliant and faithful effort to define the boundaries within which that conversation can happen. It doesn't shut down the conversation. It just says, around these 4 topics, these are the boundaries in which we think a faithful witness to Jesus can be made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when we, and that was necessary because the human imagination can go all sorts of places.
Yeah.
One of the most memorable experiences of my misspent youth in Mexico was to go to the Mercado Libertad behind the orphanage downtown, the famous orphanage downtown Guadalajara, down the hill, and the front of it was veg, fruits, veg, meats, stuff of life. Second was clothing and some touristy things. In the very back were the practitioners of Santeria. And there's all sorts of interesting merchandise there, and it was also intermingled with all sorts of Christian symbolism. And in effect, Christ became, how can I say it, a means of or an element of a voodoo culture. And it was very creepy. Yeah, sure. Kind of, my little white ass, excuse me, got out of there because I don't belong here.
Yeah.
I retreated, but it was very creepy. And with that clear definition, those sorts of things can happen, and those sorts of things happen in much more polite ways in our culture too. By the way, So but Stuart, you're right. There had to be the definition, or else it would have unwound.
Yeah. And we're probably coming to a close here, but I'll kind of say one more thing, and if you want to make a comment, but it seems like the efforts of the church in 451 of putting boundaries around something that was so fundamental to their understanding of the resurrection and who Jesus is, that it felt like we can't move forward unless we get this right. It does seem like the same opportunity that we have before us today is that if we're going to move forward, we have to still make sure we get some things right. That there are things that are going to look different in the next 50 to 100 years of church, but there are also some things that we remember that there was blood, sweat, and tears spilt over this, so that we knew how to be the church moving forward. And not everything is up for reinterpretation or whatever you want to, whatever word you can put there, but that there are things that we still lean on. We're still standing on the shoulders of giants that have come before us.
Yeah, I think that brings us full circle, Josh. I mean, what Wes was talking about at the beginning with Solzhenitsyn and recognition of the de-Christianization of American society. I'm not going to try to turn back the clock, and I'm not even going to try to say it was like a violation of God's will or anything. I think historically it is what it is. American society is religiously diverse and that's just a fact. And the question is, what is faithful Christian witness in a time in which that's the case? There are many who would like to replay church history and who would like to reopen the canon of Scripture, who would like to say, there are many different Christianities out there early on, and it was basically a power game by the part of some people to exclude some while including others. And that plays into certain modern suspicions of institutions and conspiracy theories. What we're trying to present in this short study is that the people who made these decisions were not power mongers. For instance, the people at Nicaea had been jailed, beaten, tortured for the sake of Christian witness, and surprisingly found themselves invited by the emperor and paid for by the emperor to gather in Nicaea for this ecumenical council. This was not some sort of great conspiracy on the part of power-hungry people. It was folks who offered their lives for the truth that they believed they found in Jesus Christ. And the development of doctrine is a similar sort of process. So yes, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and we have this incredible inheritance that has been provided to us that has spared us an awful lot of pain and sorrow and labor. And we just do well to remember what an incredible inheritance we have, and to bear witness to it, to utilize it, because our task in this day, as you invited us to, Josh, is to bear witness in a time in which faith in this particular God is not as strong as it used to be. But if it could go as well as it did in the first 3 centuries in that world, then I have no doubts about the ability of this message to find willing ears and great flourishing in our time.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I would close by encouraging everyone to grab this book.
Yeah,
grab this book. It's on Amazon.
Yeah.
It dates from 1997, and it's collections of some journal articles, but the writing is very engaging.
For those listening, for those just listening and not watching, that's Rodney Stark, The Rise of Christianity. Do I have that right? Yeah.
Yeah, correct. And that's one of several books that he's authored, which are fascinating reading. We are blessed if we will embrace it with the gift of some stable theology.
Yeah.
And they're in the Apostles' Creed and Nicene Creed.
Yeah.
Start there.
Yeah.
And one of the measures of how do I know I'm a Christian is I can stand up anywhere, recite those 2 pieces of prose with a happy heart.
Yeah.
Anywhere, anytime, I'm there. And so that eases some anxieties right there. But we have to in effect plant this without being hostile, without being angry. We have to plant the flag and say, we know this is true. Mm-hmm. It may upset you, but we know this is true. And everything flows out of this. Is what Bonhoeffer had to say in his generation. And he wrote the phrase, has there ever been a generation with so little ground under our feet? And that was toward the beginning of his essay, Last 10 Years, about the last 10 years. It was buried in his garden and dug up after he died. But that phrase just, has there ever been a generation with so little ground under its feet? And we're coming back around to that. Yeah. We can joyfully, happily, and peacefully plant the flag for ethical monotheism. And we can joyfully, happily plant the flag for the incarnation, life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And all that implies, and we can very happily plant the flag about Apostles and Nicene Creed as being stable and reliable. We can happily plant the flag about the stability and reliability of Scripture as it has been handed to us, and that alone in our culture is going to be offensive enough to multitudes of people.
Yeah.
But winsome to others.
Yeah.
But winsome to others.
But winsome to others.
Yeah, but the great hunger and the great longing of the human heart is eventually and inevitably found in the message of the Christian gospel. And we don't, and we need to keep that in mind. Just like, because the unrest is very palpable within Western culture. And so I could go on and on and on and on. But there we go. But
Yeah.
and we can also unapologetically declare ourselves to be that Christendom is worth embracing, and not.
Well, I'm gonna have to disagree with you there, Wes. I just think it's gone. I think Christendom is gone.
But it's there. No,
historically, and we can't wrestle it back. So I just think we're going to have to adapt to, what it is now.
But there's this entire corpus, of work that stands behind us.
Oh yeah, for sure.
We need not hide it or apologize for it.
Yeah,
and that's one of my soapboxes, and I'll quit now.
Well, and it sounds like there's some makings for another podcast for another day at another time.
You're a lucky man, Josh.
Yeah. There you go. I'll quit.
Wes, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation.
Thank you for inviting me. I hope I didn't rattle on too much.
Oh no, that's what we do here.
We're here to talk.
Okay.
So so we'll have another podcast. We'll call it Rattle On, and we'll keep it going. So thank you all for tuning in. Next Thursday, noon, the lunch hour, we'll be back here again for another conversation on another turning point in church history. Y'all take care, and we will see you soon.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye.